we've said right the way through the Mishnah of Nazir that there are incredibly strong connections between the Mishnah of Nazir, which is to do with not cutting your hair, not drinking not drinking wine, not coming into contact with a dead body, and the Mishnah of Netarim, which is about keeping your word. And by the way, you may ask, why do either of these tractates sit in the Seder of Moed, in the Seder of Nashim, in the order of women? And maybe we've touched on that question once more. We won't get into it now. But there's a third theme that runs right the way through all of these tractates, which is the theme of what we do with sacrifices or with material which is dedicated to the temple and we can't use anymore. And we're going to pick up now in the middle of the 4th chapter of Nazir, and we're going to see these themes intersect. And we are picking up with a story of the woman who vowed to be a Nazirah. We learned, by the way, at the end of the previous chapter about Queen Helena, who was a Nazirah for 21 years. She was so grateful that her son came back healthy from the war. She was a Nazirah for 21 years. So we have examples of women who swear they want to be a Nazirah. But in this case, so they're not going to cut their hair and they're not going to touch wine. And maybe their husband objects. Maybe he will annul that vow because he can't take it. He can't take the idea of a wife who won't share a glass of wine with him in the evening. It's really, really, I mean, maybe this is, you can see why this now appears in the tractate, in the order of Nashim. So he can annul the vow, but up to what point? And this question, up to what point, is the question where the Mishnah begins, the 5th Mishnah of the 4th chapter. Nizrak aleha echad min hadamim. So one of the bloods was sprinkled. So she's taken the vow. She's been in the Nazirah. She's brought a sacrifice. It's been slaughtered, and the blood has started to be sprinkled on the altar. So at that point, we're done. Well, we're nearly done because she still has to cut her hair. She hasn't yet cut her hair. And the Mishnah rules, Eino yachol lahafer. He can no longer annul. Once the blood has begun to be sprinkled, he can no longer annul. Rabbi Akiva says, Rabbi Akiva says, even if one of the animals had already been slaughtered, so this is a little bit earlier than when the blood is sprinkled, he can't annul. But the Mishnah is now going to qualify this down. It's going to, let's say, shrink slightly the situation. And it's going to ask, B'mei Devarim Amorim, what are we talking about here? And the Mishnah is going to make a distinction between two kinds of shaving. We do shave at the end of the Nazir period. And by the way, the hair is burnt on the altar with the sacrifices, with the bread which is brought. But if we come into contact with a corpse during the period of Nazirut, or if we come back into contact with a corpse at any point, we're cleansed with the water with the ashes of the red heifer on the 3rd and the 7th day. And then on the 7th day, we shave and we bring an offering. So there are actually two shavings. One shaving, which you could say is accidental in the middle of the Nazirut. It's just to take care of the fact that we've accidentally coming into contact with a dead body. And there's another shaving at the end of the Nazirut. And this is the distinction that the Mishnah wants to bring. So when it asks, B'mei Devarim Amorim, what are we talking about here? It's going to explain, B'tiglachet hata'ara, with shaving in purity. And that means with a shaving at the end of the period of Nazirut. If we're talking about bringing the animal at the end of the period of Nazirut, the husband can no longer annul. But it's going to be different. Aval, b'tiglachat hatzuma, with the shaving after uncleanness, the shaving after she's come into contact with a dead body, when she's going to have at least 30 days more Nazirut to run. At that point, yafer, at that point, he can annul. Shehu yochol lamar, because he can say, ifshi, isha mulnuvelet, I do not want an uncomely wife. And the commentators say here there's something, there's something about a wife who actually won't share a glass of wine. We're not talking here about cutting off hair. Maybe there's something about the mental state that goes with not being willing to share a cup of wine that makes a woman manuvalid. But for some reason, this sort of disturbs the relationship between husband and wife. He can annul the vow. Rebbe Omer, af, Rebbe says he can annul even at the final shaving, at the end of the period of Nazirut, right up to the very last second, he can annul. Shehu Yochol Lamar, because he can say, Efshi, Isha Mugulachat. I do not want a woman who's shaved. It seems to be, again, we don't hear, by the way, about the view of a woman as to what she thinks about a man who's shaved. But we're hearing somehow some strong objection from her husband that his wife doesn't have hair. Really, really interesting social view coming through the Mishnah. And then that's the end of the discussion about husband and wife. But the Mishnah then goes on to goes back to the theme of these unused sacrifices with the question of a man and his son. Ha'ish madir et beno v'nazir, ve'ein ha'isha madir et bena b'nazir. A man can make his son a nazir, but a woman cannot. And it asks Keitzad. The Rambam comments here, by the way, hu inyan shiva mipnei Kabbalah. This idea comes from tradition. Ein lo smach b'Torah ve'lo remez. There's no support or hint in the Torah. Somehow we've got this halacha brought down, halacha la Moshe Sinai, that a man can impose a nazir vow on his son. Gilach or shegilchu krovim mchei or shemechuhu krovim. What if? So he's imposed this vow on his son. What if he shaves, or he is shaved by his relatives? So he's broken it, or he protests, or his relatives protest on his behalf. So he's a minor. His father's made him do this, and he protests or his relatives protest. And the halacha, by the way, and the assumption of the Mishnah is the protest stands. He's got the right to protest. His relatives have the right to protest. So what happens to the sacrifices? And we're going to now repeat the halacha that we learned in the third, I think it's the fourth Mishnah, the third Mishnah. So if he'd set aside an animal, the burnt offering is left to die. Rashi says it's actually starved, but we can't kill it, we can't use it, we leave it to die. The burnt offering's offered as a burnt offering. The peace offering will be offered as a peace offering. And they may only be eaten for one day. That's the halacha for a Nazir offering, not for a regular offering. And they don't require the loaves of bread. The loaves of bread which are brought with the Nazir offering are actually connected with the head shaving, so that they're not required. If he'd just set aside money in general, then that is used for voluntary offerings. If he specified money for the offering, so the money is set aside, cash for each animal. So we can't let the sin offering die because it's just money, right? It's not a sin offering yet, and it won't die. But the closest thing we can get to killing money is we throw it in the Dead Sea. So the money for the sin offerings to be thrown in the Dead Sea. Lo henin velo mulim, you can't benefit from it, but there's no din of me'ilah, no din of sacrilege if we throw it away. Demei olah yavo olah, so the money for the olah is to be brought and purchased, invested in an olah. Umualim bahen, and obviously you can't misuse that. Demei shlamim yavo shlamim, so the money for the peace offering they bring for a peace offering. And it's eaten on the same day. It doesn't require bread, just as we learned for the real offering. And this Mishnah is a copy of the third Mishnah. Interestingly, we saw in the third Mishnah, we saw a textual error in Kaufman. Very unusual to see a textual error in Kaufman. We did see one. We had, I think, the Kaufman had haita lo instead of haita la. If Kaufman had, if he had set aside an animal rather than if she had set aside an animal, in the case of the woman who'd sworn. And you can, but of course, here the he belongs to the father, and we can see now why he has crept into the earlier Mishnah just by a ditography from this Mishnah here.